The most uncomfortable truth is this: abuse doesn't collapse because the victim speaks first. It collapses because the witnesses finally get tired of lying for the abuser. This is not one of those stories where the truth politely knocks and waits to be invited in. It kicked the door open, dragged receipts behind it, and sat down unannounced. For a long time, what happened was packaged as relationship issues, watered down into misunderstandings and brushed off with the classic excuse of intensity being mistaken for love. That story worked until it didn't. And when it stopped working, people noticed all at once. Here's a fact most people don't like to admit. Abusive dynamics are rarely invisible. Studies on relational abuse consistently show that friends, co-workers, and even strangers often notice controlling or demeaning behavior long before the victim feels safe enough to name it. The silence around abuse is not usually ignorance. It's discomfort. And discomfort has an expiration date. When it expires, the truth doesn't whisper. It echoes. What's happening now isn't random outrage or sudden loyalty. It's delayed clarity. People are standing up because patterns became undeniable. Tone, timing, reactions, public behavior, all the little things that were once ignored suddenly lined up like a confession no one needed to force. And once people see a pattern, they can't unsee it. That's when the mood shifts. That's when the defending stops and the reckoning begins. There's also something quietly ironic about moments like this. The person who worked hardest to control the narrative usually ends up being undone by it. Every attempt to look calm looks calculated. Every outburst looks like confirmation. It's almost tragic, if it weren't so predictable. At some point, rage stops looking like pain and starts looking like bad public relations. So this isn't about revenge. It's not even about exposure. It's about recognition. The kind that happens when enough people realize, at the same time, that what they were watching wasn't love, conflict, or passion. It was abuse wearing a very convincing costume. And once the costume comes off, the audience doesn't clap. They stand up. Number one, the truth came out because it could no longer be controlled. For a long time, the truth was not hidden because it was weak. It was hidden because someone was actively managing it. Abuse doesn't survive by force alone. It survives through editing. What people saw was carefully filtered, softened, reframed, and explained away. Certain moments were excused as stress. Certain reactions were labeled as misunderstandings. Certain behaviors were dressed up as, "That's just how they are." Control didn't look loud at first. It looked reasonable. That's why it lasted. But control has limits. It depends on everyone playing their role perfectly. The victim staying quiet, the witnesses staying unsure, and the abuser staying consistent. The problem is that patterns don't stay obedient. Over time, cracks form. The same tone shows up too often. The same put-downs repeat. The same defensiveness surfaces in public. People don't need a confession when repetition does the talking. What really breaks control is not confrontation, but accumulation. Each moment stacks on the last. A sharp comment here, a dismissive reaction there, an overreaction that doesn't fit the situation. Slowly, people stop needing explanations. They start trusting what they're seeing. That's when control starts slipping, because explanations only work on confusion. Once clarity sets in, excuses lose their grip. This is why the truth didn't explode all at once. It leaked. It seeped through side comments, body language, and emotional residue left behind in rooms long after conversations ended. People compared notes without even realizing it. And when enough people reached the same conclusion independently, the narrative could no longer be steered. At that point, the truth didn't need protection. It didn't need a spokesperson. It stood on its own. Attempts to shut it down only made it louder. Attempts to deny it only sharpened it. Control turned into exposure, because controlling behavior always panics when it's no longer believed. That's the part most people miss. The truth didn't come out because someone decided to reveal it. It came out because it became unmanageable. Too many eyes were open, too many patterns were obvious, and once control fails, the truth doesn't ask permission. It takes its place. Number 2, people aren't defending you out of loyalty, but recognition. When people step in on your behalf, it rarely has anything to do with allegiance or obligation. They aren't heroes rushing to save you. They are witnesses finally acknowledging what they always saw but couldn't articulate. Recognition is subtle but powerful. It's the quiet click in someone's mind when they realize, this was wrong all along. It doesn't matter how long the silence lasted or how convincing the excuses were. Once someone recognizes abuse for what it truly is, defending the victim becomes almost instinctual. It's not about you personally. It's about the undeniable truth that your experience mattered. The people rising up now aren't acting out of sympathy alone. They are acting out of understanding. They've pieced together the behavior patterns, the manipulations, the dismissals, and it finally clicks. This isn't emotional theater. It's observation turned into action. They know what was happening wasn't love, wasn't harmless conflict, and certainly wasn't normal. Recognition isn't just seeing, it's interpreting. And once people interpret the signs correctly, their energy shifts from passive awareness to vocal support. This moment also exposes a strange human tendency. Many assume that support is always transactional, that someone steps up for you because they owe you something. But recognition works differently. People don't need a reason to acknowledge the truth. They need evidence, consistency, and the courage to admit it openly. Once those lines are crossed, defending you isn't a favor. It's a logical conclusion. It's the natural response to realizing that what happened to you was unacceptable. In fact, recognition often comes with anger, directed not at you, but at the abuser and the system that allowed the abuse to be minimized. The intensity of their reaction is proof they aren't just being loyal. It's a mirror reflecting what you endured and validating it in real time. People are standing up because they see the reality, not because they were asked to, and when recognition hits hard enough, it resonates far beyond your circle, creating a wave that can no longer be ignored. In the end, this is why support feels so powerful and undeniable. People aren't defending you. They're finally seeing clearly, and seeing clearly is contagious. Once recognition spreads, silence doesn't survive. Number 3. Your ex didn't lose power over you. They lost credibility with everyone else. Abusers thrive on control, but control is only one side of the coin. The other side is credibility. For years, your ex relied on the story they told about you, about your relationship, and about every interaction you had. That story was carefully crafted to make them look reasonable, even lovable, and to make you appear unstable, dramatic, or too sensitive. In private, it worked. People believed parts of it because it fit the narrative they were willing to accept. That's how they maintained power, not through force alone, but by convincing everyone else that their version of reality was the truth. What changed now is simple but devastating. Credibility cannot survive when evidence contradicts it consistently. Every witness, every shared observation, every leaked detail chipped away at the carefully constructed story. What your ex thought was hidden or manageable started showing up in plain sight. People began comparing experiences, noticing patterns, and realizing the gaps between words and reality. And when credibility collapses, power becomes meaningless. You can't control someone when everyone else sees through you. You can't manipulate reality if reality refuses to cooperate. Losing credibility is also why their rage seems louder than their logic. When someone is exposed, their instinct isn't reflection, it's deflection. They lash out, overcompensate, and try to rewrite the story. But the more they do, the clearer it becomes that the problem wasn't you, it was them. Their audience isn't fooled anymore. Every attempt to regain dominance only reminds people of the truth they are now choosing to acknowledge openly. This shift is powerful because it doesn't just affect your relationship with them. It alters how everyone around you perceives the situation. Support is no longer quiet, hesitant, or hesitant to speak. Recognition turns into collective validation. The X's power never actually disappeared. It was only the illusion of control that kept people quiet. Now that illusion is shattered, and the truth is undeniable. In the end, losing credibility is far worse than losing control. Control can be regained, but once everyone sees who you really are, your influence evaporates. That's what makes this moment so decisive. The X is no longer feared, they are seen, and being seen is irreversible. Number 4. Your X's anger is not pain, it's loss of narrative dominance. What most people mistake for genuine remorse or emotional hurt is often something far simpler and more revealing: the loss of control. Your X isn't truly suffering because of the breakup or the consequences of their behavior. They are reacting to the fact that their carefully constructed story no longer holds sway. For years, they controlled not just you, but how everyone else saw you and the relationship. Every excuse, every manipulation, every lie was a tool to maintain dominance over the narrative. When that narrative crumbles, anger is the predictable response. It's loud, it's frantic, and it's ultimately about image, not emotion. Anger in this context is an attempt to reclaim influence. It's a desperate effort to reframe reality, to convince others that the truth isn't what they're seeing, and that they, the abuser, are still in charge. Every outburst, every defensive explanation, every attempt to discredit witnesses is a signal that they recognize their grip is slipping. The fury is less about loss of love or attachment and more about loss of authority. What they once controlled silently or subtly is now visible to everyone, and visibility is terrifying for someone built on manipulation. The intensity of their reactions also exposes something critical. The illusion of power is always fragile. Real influence doesn't panic when challenged. Real respect doesn't need to be enforced through anger. Your X's rage is evidence of their dependence on deception to maintain their position. Once the deception fails, the facade cracks, and their emotions erupt not from genuine pain, but from exposure. Observers can often see this clearly. The more irrational or theatrical the anger, the more obvious the underlying truth. The abuser is reacting to loss of narrative control, not to the relationship itself. And that's why public support for you grows stronger. The anger, instead of intimidating or silencing, confirms what people already suspect. It's a public admission that the abuser can no longer manipulate perception and that their version of events is collapsing under scrutiny. In the end, their fury isn't proof of depth or feeling, it's proof of exposure. The narrative they fought so hard to control has slipped away, and what they feel now is not pain, but the helpless panic of losing the story they once wrote. Number 5. The outrage isn't sudden, it's delayed accountability. What's happening now didn't appear out of nowhere. The anger, the calls for justice, the voices rallying on your behalf, they are the result of time finally catching up with deception. Abuse doesn't shock people the moment it occurs. Most of the time, it seeps quietly into relationships, cleverly disguised as normal tension or emotional intensity. Friends, family, and bystanders notice little pieces here and there, but without the full picture, their reactions are muted. They may hesitate, doubt themselves, or even rationalize the behavior to protect someone they care about. This is why outrage often seems delayed. It isn't absent, it's accumulating. Delayed accountability works like gravity. Each incident, each slight, each manipulation adds weight. Individually, it might feel insignificant or forgivable. Collectively, it becomes undeniable. People don't suddenly wake up one day and decide to take sides. They reach a breaking point when patterns can no longer be ignored or excused. When the same behaviors repeat over time, when the same lies are told and the same boundaries are violated, observers start connecting dots. That's when outrage begins to emerge, not as an emotional reflex, but as a response to undeniable truth. This delayed accountability also serves a deeper function. It demonstrates that actions have consequences, even if they are postponed. People may have been silent or cautious in the past, but the eventual reaction proves that the world doesn't forget. Witnesses are no longer willing to tolerate deception or manipulation. Their voices amplify because what once went unchallenged is now impossible to ignore. Importantly, this is why your ex's attempts to cover up or explain away their behavior fail so spectacularly. Outrage isn't a whim. It's a calculated response to patterns, evidence, and consistency of abuse. What appears sudden is actually the result of a long chain of accountability catching up to reality. The silence that once protected them has dissolved, and the truth now stands unopposed, validated by everyone who finally refuses to look the other way. In the end, delayed accountability proves one thing: timing doesn't diminish the impact of justice. It only strengthens it, making the reckoning sharper, louder, and impossible to deny. Number 6. What looked like chemistry was actually coercion masked as intensity. For a long time, people might have assumed the highs and lows of your relationship were just passion, that the arguments, the intensity, and the moments of control were part of being in love. But what felt like chemistry was something far darker. It wasn't mutual excitement or connection. It was manipulation dressed up as emotional depth. Coercion often hides behind intensity. It thrives in extremes, in the moments that feel electrifying or overwhelming, because those moments make the next controlling behavior easier to accept. The very things that seemed exciting were the things that trained people around you to normalize what shouldn't have been normal. When people finally see it clearly, the realization hits hard. That look of passion wasn't a sign of love. It was a tool of control. Every argument that escalated too quickly, every apology that seemed too perfect, every cycle of love then fear was part of a carefully orchestrated pattern. Observers who ignored it before or rationalized it are now able to separate what was real from what was staged. What they thought was connection was manipulation. What they thought was emotion was strategic. And that clarity creates anger, not because you were weak, but because the truth of the deception becomes undeniable. This also explains why people are so quick to stand up for you now. Coercion relies on silence and confusion. When outside witnesses start connecting the dots, the patterns they dismissed before suddenly make sense. The intensity that seemed thrilling now looks toxic. The behavior that seemed passionate now looks abusive. Recognition isn't about pity, it's about finally seeing reality clearly, and reality does not need defense. The cruel irony is that coercion depends on belief. The abuser needs everyone to accept the chemistry story. The moment that belief dissolves, the manipulator loses more than control. They lose credibility, influence, and respect. What once seemed intoxicating now looks like a warning. And for you, that clarity from others doesn't just validate your experience, It exposes the mechanics of abuse so plainly that no excuse can survive. This is why the outrage isn't misplaced. People aren't angry about drama. They're angry because they finally see the truth behind what was disguised as love, and that truth is impossible to ignore. Number 7. You survived something others would have normalized forever. Enduring abuse is often portrayed as weakness, but the truth is far from it. What you went through required courage, awareness, and a resilience most people never develop because they never face the same intensity of manipulation. Many would have accepted it as part of life, as part of love, or as just how relationships work. That's the insidious part of abuse. It looks ordinary until you step outside it and realize how extreme it really was. Surviving it is not just a personal victory. It's proof that you refuse to let a toxic narrative define your existence. What makes this so extraordinary is the subtlety of abuse. It doesn't always leave visible scars. It seeps into everyday interactions, erodes self-esteem, and rewires perceptions of normalcy. People around you might have ignored the warning signs because they seemed small, isolated, or explainable. The danger lies in how easy it is to adapt to dysfunction. Most people don't realize they are in an abusive situation until years later, after they've spent a lifetime justifying what shouldn't have been tolerated. You, however, endured it, recognized it, and didn't allow it to remain your identity. That distinction sets you apart. Surviving abuse also exposes the courage in simply showing up afterward. Life doesn't pause while healing takes place. You continue to exist, interact, and reclaim your narrative in real time. Many would have retreated into silence, letting the experience define them entirely. You refused that. Your presence, your story, and your resilience force observers to confront the truth they may have ignored before. That recognition of survival becomes contagious, inspiring others to question the situations they silently tolerate in their own lives. There is also a deeper consequence. By surviving, you stripped the abuser of invisibility. What they thought would remain hidden forever is now undeniable. And the people standing up for you are reacting not just to the story itself, but to the courage you displayed in living it fully and honestly. That's why survival is revolutionary. It's not about victimhood, it's about reclaiming power, rewriting history, and setting a standard that refuses to accept abuse as normal. In the end, surviving something others would have normalized forever is more than victory. It's proof that enduring does not mean submission, and that awareness and courage can transform pain into undeniable strength. Number 8. Your healing exposed the lie that you were the problem. For far too long, the narrative was stacked against you. Every confrontation, every manipulation, every subtle jab was framed in a way that made you question yourself. Maybe you were told you were overreacting, too sensitive, or even crazy for noticing patterns no one else seemed to see. The abuser's greatest weapon wasn't anger or control. It was convincing you that the problem was inside you, not in their behavior. That lie is what isolates people, makes them second-guess themselves, and keeps manipulation alive. Healing is dangerous for abusers. It doesn't just involve recovery, it involves revelation. When you began to rebuild, to set boundaries, to reclaim your sense of self, you started challenging the story that framed you as the problem. Every step you took toward clarity became evidence that their narrative was false. You weren't the one causing conflict. You weren't the one manipulating situations. You weren't the one twisting words and emotions. Your healing illuminated the truth that had been buried under lies and excuses for too long. This exposure doesn't happen quietly. Observers, even those who were hesitant before, begin to notice the contrast. They see the abuser's patterns more clearly because your response no longer reinforces the illusion. You speaking up, setting limits, or simply existing without fear becomes undeniable proof. People start to question their previous assumptions, and suddenly the abuser is the one under scrutiny. The tables turn because healing is evidence in motion. Healing also has an almost electric effect on those around you. It's contagious, inspiring others to recognize what they might have overlooked in their own lives. It forces accountability without confrontation, showing that growth and self-preservation aren't threats. They're truths that cannot be erased. Ultimately, your healing did more than mend your own wounds. It rewrote the story. It exposed the lie that the problem was ever you, and shifted the focus onto the one who created the toxic dynamic in the first place. That revelation is both liberating and devastating, but above all, it's undeniable. The truth isn't silent anymore, and it is finally being seen for what it is. Number 9. The public reaction isn't about drama. It's about pattern recognition. What people are feeling right now isn't just a spontaneous surge of emotion or a desire to create drama. It's much deeper than that. It's their brains and instincts piecing together patterns that were hidden in plain sight for too long. Abuse doesn't exist in isolated incidents. It shows up repeatedly in predictable behaviors, in recurring manipulations, in cycles of charm followed by control. Even if no one spoke, those patterns were visible to the careful observer. And now, after the evidence has accumulated, recognition hits hard. Pattern recognition is one of the most instinctive ways humans understand the world. When enough behaviors repeat themselves, the mind begins to see connections, motives, and consequences that were invisible in the moment. What once seemed like minor disagreements, overreactions, or personality quirks now reveal themselves as deliberate, strategic, and harmful actions. Observers don't just feel sympathy, they feel clarity. That clarity breeds anger, because no one likes to realize they missed the obvious for so long, and it also breeds validation, because it confirms what you were already living through. This is why the reaction seems overwhelming. It isn't fueled by rumor or emotion alone, it's fueled by understanding. People are not defending you merely because they like you or because they're taking sides. They're defending reality, the factual sequence of repeated harm that can no longer be ignored or excused. Recognition of patterns bypasses charm, excuses, and manipulation, leaving only the truth exposed. What makes this even more powerful is that pattern recognition doesn't require a single dramatic event. It requires observation over time. And once observers start connecting the dots, the system that allowed abuse to continue, friends who looked away, family who rationalized, colleagues who stayed silent, begins to collapse. Each pattern is a piece of undeniable evidence. In the end, the public reaction isn't about spectacle or gossip, it's the natural outcome of people finally seeing clearly. Patterns don't lie, and when enough people recognize them, the abuser's story falls apart, leaving only truth standing unshakable, validated, and unstoppable. Number 10. You didn't need to convince anyone. The behavior testified for itself. The truth rarely needs a loud voice. In your case, every action your ex took left its own undeniable evidence. Every manipulation, every lie, every moment of control or cruelty was a statement, and it spoke louder than any explanation could. You didn't have to plead your case or gather proof to make people see. The behavior itself was testimony. Patterns don't lie. Consistency doesn't argue. And once the audience started paying attention, the facts were impossible to ignore. Abusers often rely on charm, excuses, and selective storytelling to shape perception. They assume people need to be convinced, that persuasion can erase observation. But what they forget is that every time they repeat the same harmful actions, they create a trail, an unintentional archive of truth. Every argument that escalated unnecessarily, every subtle put-down, every contradictory statement contributed to a bigger picture that no one could rationalize away. People began noticing before you even spoke, because behavior cannot be fully disguised. It leaves traces, patterns, and consequences that accumulate into evidence. This is why the public's reaction is so raw and automatic. Observers didn't need your permission to see the reality of what happened. They didn't need your account to validate their own perception. Once the repeated actions were visible, the truth essentially announced itself. Your ex's attempts at control or narrative spin became irrelevant, because actions had already testified. The more they tried to defend themselves, the louder the evidence of their behavior became. This point is critical because it reframes power. You didn't gain support because you begged for it or strategically revealed your story. You gained it because truth is self-evident when it manifests in repeated, undeniable patterns, and people respond instinctively to evidence, not persuasion. The behavior you endured carried the weight of proof, and once that proof was observed, validation followed naturally. In the end, the power wasn't in your voice. It was in the reality of what happened. The truth spoke for itself, louder and more convincingly than anyone could have argued, and that's why support, outrage, and recognition arrived not because you asked, but because it was inevitable. Number 11. The support you're receiving is proof you were never too sensitive. For years, you were made to question yourself. Every reaction you had, every boundary you set, every moment you expressed discomfort was twisted into proof that you were overreacting, too emotional, or reading too much into things. That's how abuse works. It rewires your perception so that you start doubting the validity of your own feelings. It's insidious because it convinces you that the problem lies within you, not in the repeated manipulation or control you experienced. And yet, the very support you're receiving now is a loud, undeniable counter to all that doubt. When people step up and validate your experience, it proves something you may have struggled to believe. Your instincts were right. Your emotions were not exaggerated. Your observations were accurate. The disbelief you faced wasn't because you were imagining things. It was because the abuser's tactics depended on making you question your own reality. Every message of support, every public acknowledgement, every voice defending you is a silent but powerful statement. You were never too sensitive. You were paying attention to the truth while others tried to ignore it. This support does more than comfort. It rewrites history. It shifts the perspective from blaming you for being emotional to recognizing that what you endured demanded awareness, courage, and resilience. People are angry not because you overreacted, but because they now see how clearly the abuse was orchestrated and how long it went unchallenged. Their validation confirms that you were right to feel what you felt, and that the manipulation you endured cannot stand against collective recognition. The irony is sharp. What once felt like isolation or invalidation has transformed into evidence of your discernment and strength. People are rallying because your experience resonates, not because they feel sorry for you, and that recognition dismantles the lie that you were too sensitive or overly dramatic. You weren't wrong for noticing. You weren't wrong for reacting. Your instincts were accurate, and now, with everyone seeing clearly, the world agrees. In the end, the support surrounding you isn't just sympathy, it's proof. Proof that your feelings were valid, your perception was sharp, and that your sensitivity was never a flaw, but a tool that allowed you to survive and ultimately expose the truth. Number 12. This moment marks the end of private harm and public silence. Abuse thrives in shadows. For years, what happened to you was contained. whispered about in hushed tones or dismissed as private conflict. The abuser counted on secrecy, knowing that silence is a powerful ally. Private harm stays invisible, leaving only confusion, doubt, and self-blame in its wake. Public silence becomes the fuel that allows the manipulation to continue unchallenged. People look away, rationalize, or pretend it isn't happening. That silence protects the abuser while isolating the victim. But now, the silence has broken. What was private is no longer invisible. What was confined to whispered fears and anxious moments has entered the collective view. Witnesses are speaking, patterns are being recognized, and the truth can no longer hide behind excuses. This shift changes everything. The abuser can no longer rely on secrecy to maintain control because the narrative has escaped their hands. When private harm enters public awareness, it becomes undeniable, tangible, and accountable. The power of this moment lies not just in exposure, but in its permanence. Once people see the truth clearly, the silence that enabled the abuse evaporates. Support emerges, outrage ignites, and recognition spreads. The abuser's attempts to rewrite history or defend themselves falter because the public now holds the context, the details, and the collective memory. The harm that once seemed invisible is now documented in people's awareness, in the acknowledgment of those who refused to look away. This turning point also empowers you in ways that private suffering never could. What was once a source of fear becomes a source of validation. Every observer who finally recognizes what happened amplifies the reality of your experience. The weight of secrecy is lifted, replaced by clarity and truth. The abuser can no longer gaslight or manipulate the narrative because their actions have been witnessed, understood, and remembered. In the end, this moment signifies more than exposure. It signifies liberation. Private harm loses its potency when it meets public accountability. Silence is replaced by voice. Isolation is replaced by recognition. And the truth, once hidden, now stands unshakable, undeniable, and irreversible. Number 13. You're not being defended, you're being validated. There's a world of difference between defense and validation. Defense implies a reaction motivated by loyalty, obligation, or emotion. People defend out of attachment, out of guilt, or even out of fear of conflict. Validation, on the other hand, is rooted in truth. It doesn't depend on feelings for you or against your ex. It depends on reality. And what's happening now is validation. People aren't just taking your side because they feel sorry for you or because they like you. They are acknowledging the facts, recognizing the repeated patterns, and confirming what you experienced. They see clearly, and their acknowledgement is unstoppable. Validation is powerful because it doesn't require your voice to persuade anyone. It doesn't matter how loud or detailed your explanations are. The evidence speaks for itself. Every act of manipulation, every insult, every attempt to control you has left traces visible to those who were paying attention. Validation arises when others can finally read those traces and see the truth for what it is. Unlike defense, which can be fickle and influenced by emotion, validation is enduring. Once people recognize the reality of abuse, their support isn't temporary. It becomes a lasting acknowledgement of the truth. This distinction also explains why your ex's attempts at damage control fail. Defense can be swayed, but validation cannot. When people validate your experience, they are confirming the facts, not just choosing sides. Every excuse, every lie, every attempt to rewrite history is powerless against collective recognition. Their credibility is gone, and nothing they say can erase the truth that has been witnessed and acknowledged. Validation also shifts the power dynamic. Where once the abuser could manipulate perception and silence witnesses, Now the truth stands on its own, amplified by those who refuse to accept distortion. You no longer carry the burden of proof alone. The people around you are confirming it as well. In the end, being validated is not about being defended. It's about reality asserting itself. The truth isn't negotiable, and when others confirm it, your experience is no longer up for debate. Validation solidifies your reality, dismantles lies, and ensures that what happened is seen, acknowledged, and remembered exactly as it was. Number 14. The truth didn't just come out. It found witnesses who refused to unsee it. Truth is powerful, but its power multiplies when it meets people who refuse to look away. What happened to you didn't remain hidden because it wasn't visible. It remained hidden because people didn't connect the dots, didn't speak up, or chose to ignore what they saw. But the moment witnesses start paying attention, the dynamic changes completely. The truth doesn't need a megaphone. It simply needs observers who are unwilling to pretend the obvious isn't there. Once that happens, exposure is inevitable. Witnesses don't just notice facts. They see patterns, behaviors, and consequences that were carefully disguised. They see the subtle ways manipulation worked, the repeated cycles of control, the tiny moments of gaslighting that built up over time. And once someone refuses to ignore these details, it's no longer possible for the abuser to maintain their narrative. Every attempt to spin, excuse, or deny is met with recognition. The witnesses themselves become the force of accountability, and that makes the truth unstoppable. This is what makes the moment so irreversible. You didn't have to convince anyone. The evidence, the patterns, the repeated behaviors, all of it was already there. What changed was who was paying attention. Witnesses refusing to unsee what they saw means that the story is no longer private, no longer negotiable, and no longer dependent on the abuser's version of events. It becomes public, undeniable, and lasting. The refusal to look away is also what fuels outrage. People are no longer hesitant, unsure, or questioning their own judgment. They see clearly, and that clarity translates into action, voices, and support for you. It's the human equivalent of collective confirmation. What once could have been dismissed now demands acknowledgment. In the end, the truth didn't just emerge, it was carried by eyes and minds that refused to remain silent. That is why this moment cannot be erased, why recognition spread so fast, and why the abuser's control has completely evaporated. The truth found witnesses, and witnesses who refuse to unsee make exposure permanent, undeniable, and transformative. Conclusion. The story you've witnessed is more than just a personal journey. It's a revelation of what happens when truth refuses to be silenced. Every act of manipulation, every lie, every attempt to control was eventually met with recognition, validation, and exposure. The anger, outrage, and support surrounding you are not random. They are the natural response to patterns that could no longer be ignored, to behavior that testified for itself, and to a truth that found witnesses who refused to unsee it. You survived when others would have normalized the harm. You healed, exposing the lie that you were the problem. And in doing so, you rewrote the narrative entirely, stripping away credibility from those who tried to control perception and replacing it with undeniable reality. This is a moment of transformation, not just for you, but for everyone observing. It's a reminder that abuse cannot hide forever, that silence only delays justice, and that truth, once witnessed, cannot be reversed. The public support you're receiving isn't sympathy, it's validation. The patterns are clear. The reality is unavoidable. What was once private and hidden is now illuminated, permanent, and irreversible. And through all of this, the most powerful fact remains. Surviving, speaking, and healing changes everything. It forces recognition, commands accountability, and inspires courage in ways that silence never could. Your story proves that truth is not fragile, it is persistent. It proves that exposure doesn't just confront the past, it reshapes the present and protects the future. And it proves that no amount of control, manipulation, or deception can withstand witnesses who refuse to turn away. In the end, the power is not in anger, in manipulation, or in the abuser's attempts at dominance. It's in reality, and reality always wins. If this video resonated with you, make sure to support the channel by subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing it with someone who needs to hear this. Every like, every share, and every voice helps spread awareness and keeps the truth alive. Don't just watch, stand, engage, and be part of the movement that refuses to let abuse stay hidden. Stay awakened, chosen ones.